Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you with the most up-to-date political, economic, and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Okay, happy Sunday everybody. I hope you're all having a restful weekend. Let's begin with 2 economic updates and then move to the main story, Blinken's trip to China specifically and US-China relations generally. According to new official data published by the National Bureau of Statistics yesterday, Saturday, China's industrial companies' profits fell in March as exports slowed and deflationary pressures continued, yet another signal that arguments that China's economy has stabilized are still premature. Industrial profits at large-scale Chinese companies declined 3.5% from a year earlier in March. State media focused on the fact that for the first 3 months of the year, Q1, profits rose 4.3% to 1.51 trillion yuan, $208 billion. But month on month, the trend isn't good. The March decline followed a 10.2% gain in the January through February period. We remember that exports unexpectedly slumped in March and domestic demand has remained weak. Indeed, the high Q1 growth was driven by infrastructure and manufacturing spending from the government. Bloomberg economists explain that falling factory gate prices have squeezed profit margins and led to industrial firms to double down on foreign markets, with domestic demand still weak amid a housing slump. Mounting geopolitical risks could make that harder. Western countries accuse China of building excess capacity in its factories and dumping cheap products abroad. And they've launched probes into industries like electric vehicles and shipbuilding, and hinted at new trade barriers. Which brings us to the next update. On Friday, China passed a law strengthening its trade defense capabilities as the United States and the European Union take aim at Beijing over excess industrial capacity. Analysts argue that the tariff law signals to China's biggest trade partners its ability to hit back should they impose tariffs on exports against China. UK-based Reuters explains that the law, which will take effect from the 1st of December, outlines a range of legal provisions related to tariffs on Chinese imports and exports, from what constitutes tax incentives to China's right to hit back at countries that renege on trade agreements. It was approved on the same day as US Secretary of State Antony Blinken visited China for talks which involved US warnings of Chinese overcapacity. We will come to the Blinken visit shortly. Henry Gao, professor at Singapore Management University, explained the new law. Quote, "It's like a nuclear weapon. The point of having it is not to use it, but to deter others from using the same against you. You could argue that this is not really necessary, as when China upgraded its foreign trade law in 2004, there were measures on applying retaliatory tariffs. But I think one point China is trying to make by including this in the new tariff law is that this is our prerogative. If you're going to hit us with tariffs, we can do the same." End quote. This is all well and good, but other commentators argue that while there is mutually assured destruction with these trade relationships, one side is much more vulnerable than the other. Quote, "Tit-for-tat tariffs are bad for the global economy, but their costs are distributed very unevenly. In a world of weak demand, their impact is likely to be much greater on surplus countries, like China, than on deficit countries, like the US. For 10 years I've argued that huge demand-suppressing trade imbalances mean that the global trade environment can only get worse. I don't think enough has changed to change the prediction." End quote. Next up, US-China diplomatic and military moves. If you enjoyed today's episode of China Update, I have a huge favor to ask. That is to like and subscribe. Only 45% of regular viewers are subscribed. Liking and subscribing is the only way in which the channel can grow. It's a big help for the algorithm. Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are also in the description for those who want to help keep the channel financially sustainable. I rely primarily on your support. There is only one sponsored video per month to ensure that the support is primarily from subscribers, and this is a big help as well. Thank you so much everybody for the ongoing support. This week saw US Secretary of State Antony Blinken visit China for a 3-day trip to Shanghai and Beijing, the second such visit to China in 12 months. Let us unpack the trip. The first 2 days saw a series of events and meetings. It was a mix of policy talk and diplomacy. The themes with leaders were mostly economic. Blinken raised concerns over unfair trade practices. He stressed that American firms need a level playing field. He also raised the issue of non-market economic practices and overcapacity. The two sides reaffirmed the importance of ties between the people of the United States and the PRC, including the expansion of exchanges between students, scholars, and businesses. Blinken cheered on the sidelines of a basketball game in Shanghai on Wednesday night and spent Thursday chatting with students at New York University's Shanghai campus and meeting American business owners. Quote, "It all went to emphasize the kind of economic, educational, and cultural ties that the United States is pointedly holding up as beneficial for both countries," end quote, in the words of US-based The New York Times. While speaking to the students at New York University's Shanghai campus, Blinken expressed, quote, "We have about almost 300,000 Chinese students in the United States, and that's something we very much support. Here in China, unfortunately, we've gone from about 15,000 students, Americans, here a decade ago or so, to now just about 800. And in fact, we hit a low of 300 during COVID and other reasons. Would like to build that back up because, again, I think it's so important to make those connections. Of course, we want to have the most welcoming environment possible so that our students feel welcome here, just as we want to make sure that Chinese students are welcome in the United States," end quote. As a quick aside, we note that on the same day, Thursday, U.S. Treasury Secretary Yellen told media that the Biden administration is not taking any options off the table to respond to China's excess industrial capacity, quote, "which is a top concern for the U.S. and its allies," end quote, adding that, quote, "China exporting its way to full employment is not acceptable to the rest of the world," end quote. Yellen added that Chinese officials, quote, "acknowledge a problem with industrial overcapacity," end quote, but that they still needed to address it. This is an interesting point, as so far Chinese officials and state media have pushed back hard against these accusations. The very same day, Thursday, China's Ministry of Commerce spokesperson expressed, quote, "Some Western countries have been accusing China of overcapacity, which is groundless, and China firmly rejects it. The capacity issue should be assessed in the context of economic globalization, global division of labor, and market dynamics in an objective, fair, and scientific manner," end quote, adding, quote, "Western countries and regions stress green development while using overcapacity as a pretext of protectionism, a typical self-contradiction and double standard," end quote. Okay, now let's return to the Blinken trip. The first 2 days were quite light, but Friday saw the big meetings, with the US Secretary of State speaking with his counterpart, top diplomat Wang Yi, and, as expected, General Secretary Xi Jinping himself. The two main points raised with Xi was the Biden administration's deep concern that cheap Chinese exports are endangering US jobs, and the threat of more sanctions on China if Beijing does not roll back its support of Russia in its war in Ukraine. In a news conference on Friday, Blinken expressed, quote, "Russia would struggle to sustain its assault on Ukraine without Chinese support. I made clear that if China does not address this problem, we will," end quote. We remember that before the trip there were reports that Washington is preparing possible sanctions on Chinese financial institutions. Blinken said that the Chinese support for Russia was creating a threat not just to Ukraine, but to Europe more broadly, and that European leaders shared those concerns. We remember in a briefing with reporters in mid-April, a senior Biden administration official said that China had provided Russia with significant quantities of semiconductors, drones, and industrial materials. Blinken also said that he had pressed China to take further actions to stem the flow of materials used to make fentanyl. Blinken added, quote, "We are committed to maintaining and strengthening lines of communication to advance that agenda and again deal responsibly with our differences so we avoid any miscommunications, any misperceptions, any miscalculations," end quote. As regular viewers know, in recent months, China and the US and her Asian allies have seen rising military tensions and moves in the region. In his 5-hour meeting with Blinken, Wang Yi emphasized that the Asia-Pacific region should not become a battleground for great powers. He said he hopes the US, quote, "will make the right choices, move towards China, achieve benign interaction in the Asia-Pacific, abandon the formation of exclusive cliques, not coerce regional countries to take sides, stop the deployment of land-based intermediate-range missiles, stop undermining China's strategic interests, and cease disrupting the hard-won peace and stability of the region." End quote. Here, Wang Yi is referring to the Mid-Range Capability Missile, MRC missile system, which was positioned on the northern island of Luzon in the Philippines for this year's Balakitan exercises. This is the first time the US has deployed this system there at that location, and this deployment is significant. At that location, it gives missile launching trucks the ability to attack Chinese ships across the strait, separating the Philippines from Taiwan, while another site about 700 miles to the southwest would allow the US to strike bases that China has built in the Spratly Islands nearby. During a regular news briefing last week, China's Foreign Ministry spokesperson accused the US of seeking a, quote, unilateral military advantage, end quote, and underscored Beijing's strong opposition to the deployment. Chinese commentators have argued that this changes the security balance in the region and is an escalation. Colin Koh, a research fellow at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Singapore, explains, quote, "This in some ways equalizes the prior situation where Chinese missiles have threatened US forces along the First Island chain, which includes the northern Philippines, Japan and Taiwan, and even further eastward along the Second Island chain, centering on Guam." End quote. This year has also seen the Pentagon gain access to multiple airfields and naval bases in the Philippines, lessening the need for aircraft carriers that could be targeted by China's long-range missiles and submarines in a time of war. The Pentagon has also gained access rights for its troops at 4 additional bases in the Philippines and could eventually host US warplanes and advanced mobile missile launchers, if Washington and Manila agree that offensive weaponry can be placed there. In 2023, the United States committed $100 million for infrastructure investments at the 9 bases, with more funds expected this year. Much of this has been possible due to greatly heightened fears in Manila of Chinese aggression in the South China Sea. Meanwhile, the United States is sending the most advanced Tomahawk cruise missiles to Japan and has established a new kind of Marine Corps regiment on Okinawa that is designed to fight from small islands and destroy ships at sea. For the first time, Japan's military will receive up to 400 of their own Tomahawk cruise missiles, which can attack ships at sea as well as targets on land from over 1,150 miles away. Plus, the United States continues to send weapons and Green Beret trainers to Taiwan. These are all significant moves on the First Island chain to counter what Washington and her allies in Asia believe is a more assertive, even aggressive, Beijing seeking to change the status quo in the region. Kurt Campbell, the new Deputy Secretary of State, even admitted in a press event last week, quote, "We've deepened our alliances and partnerships abroad in ways that would have been unthinkable just a few years ago." End quote. We are indeed living in a world where what once seemed unthinkable is fast becoming reality. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much everybody for watching. Have a great Sunday, and I will see you all tomorrow.